Miagwib Galer Accordia August Fáilte Road. Welcome to be my guest with me, Mary Honan, on Lear Media TV, supporting the Samaritans, Limerick and Tipperary. And my very special guest today is Richard Squire, who's a writer, educator, and owner of Life Story. And he writes people's memoirs for them in their own words, creating a legacy that families will cherish for generations. Life Story has written many books for families celebrating their loved ones' fascinating lives. Clients include Holocaust survivors, war veterans, business moguls, a baker, a film director, foreign service officers, parents, grandparents, great grandparents, spouses, and many, many more. He's a former writing professor with 2 master's degrees and has worked in the corporate communications for many years. In 2015, his grandfather, a World War II war veteran, asked Richard to write his memoir, and the experience was so fulfilling that Richard was inspired to create Life Story, the perfect union between his passion for writing and storytelling with his love of family and history. Hi, Richard. Welcome
Hi,
to Lear Media TV.
thank you so much. Thanks for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
How did you, I was saying off camera to you, you're somebody I've been really interested in talking to because I'm very interested and have, I suppose, the Irish side of me, my the Irish blood leans towards storytelling. Irish people are known storytellers, and my mother was always telling stories. She would have been fantastic as a writer if she had actually managed to put every one of her stories down. How did you get involved in writing stories and writing other people's stories and memories?
Well, from the beginning, I've just been a huge fan of stories. I was
Yeah.
very big into film. My father was a film buff, and from a very young age, we were watching Godfather, and I was obsessed with Wizard of Oz, and even at a young age, I was
No, I
watching.
never got into Wizard of Oz.
Oh, that's like one of my favorite movies.
No, never did. I don't know why. Wasn't
Well,
my,
maybe
yeah,
maybe give it another try. I don't.
maybe I will.
Yeah, but and I was always into reading, and as I got older, I got into it more and more. And when I went to university, I went to the University of Vermont for undergraduate, and there was kind of like no question what I was going to study. I didn't want to do math or science. It had to be
Oh,
around story, so I majored in
yeah.
English literature. I minored in film. I did some film production and film theory. So it was always just kind of my natural inclination. And when I was younger, I was writing stories, I was writing poetry, and I was also listening to my family stories.
Yeah.
It wasn't even a decision, it was just kind of natural. I was always, and my grandfather is the one. He's the whole idea for Life Story, the whole light bulb moment, the aha moment came from my grandfather who fought in World War II. And he used to tell us stories. And he had these scars on his legs, these raised scars from
Okay.
battles. And I just used to marvel at them and sort of touch them. And there was one story that I always asked him to tell me over and over again. And that was sort of like the main thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's funny. It's funny you talk about that, and there's actually a book. It was turned into a film, and it was the Devil's Arithmetic, and she talks about how her grandmother's story and her grandfather's story became so boring to her all the time. And for years, it's a fictional time travel novel about a young Jewish girl who has no interest in, she's so sick of listening at Seder dinner to her grandparents' stories about times that happened years ago. And she's no interest in it until she ends up during the Cedar dinner going back in time and ending up becoming her aunt who didn't survive the Holocaust, who she was called after. And then she suddenly had this awakening, and she realized that their past was her past, and it was something that, as being her past and her future, that she had to tell. She had to tell that their story became her story, and future people in her family story. Did you feel very much like that, that your grandfather's story became your story now because you inherited it?
When I was young, I didn't think of it that way, but I do now. I feel that, younger people aren't really thinking about that. They're going about their lives, and
Yeah,
but inevitably, I feel like almost everyone, they get to a certain point where they become interested in
yeah,
the history of their family. Usually, maybe when they're, say, early 20s or late teens. Very often when it's too late, they start asking questions, and, um, you know, may, maybe they're, their elders already passed away, so they're not getting the most direct answers, and
yeah,
they're, and the stories kind of fade if you don't capture them. But I but I became very interested in that, and I do feel that. And in some of my readings, I came across a study. It was done at Emory University, and it was talking about the intergenerational self. And they did this study where people who knew about their family narratives across generations and understood the context in which they come from actually had better emotional health. And so I
yeah,
believe that. I think
yeah,
it's therapeutic.
absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I think if you can actually, sit back and realize that the past is actually as much your past as it is the person's past who physically lived through it, through their stories, or if you're actually open to listening to somebody's past, then that automatically, by osmosis, becomes your past because you've inherited it. It's
Yeah.
something that you have been handed down to pass to future generations. And it's like every bequest, it's an absolute privilege when you've been handed that to actually pass on. I mean, I do a lot of interviews with survivors of genocide, with lots of people from all walks of life, irrespective of genocide. But I have a channel that's specifically for victims of genocide and specifically the Holocaust. And I feel ultimately privileged that these people have actually told me their story, because as the survivors are dying out, we're going to be, you and I are going to be I suppose, the flag bearers, if you like, or the torch bearers for the future generations. And you would hope that people who would carry that baton and keep carrying that baton into further generations.
It's true. And I do, I have come to feel that my grandfather's story is my story. And I feel that, like, all of the lives of our stories, they're chapters in the larger story.
Yeah,
And yeah. And it's a responsibility really to capture them and pass them on, because otherwise they fade away. And especially when it comes to something like the Holocaust, we
yeah,
have to never forget. And I actually have this, I did a Holocaust anthology, which is maybe the book I'm most proud of. I interviewed 11 Holocaust survivors. I partnered with a with Care One, a assisted living facility,
okay,
who is a Jewish, it's a Jewish Care One. And so a lot of, Holocaust survivors came through, and whenever they had another one come through, they contacted me. And I found that, I mean, a lot of Holocaust survivors, some of them are happy to share their stories. A lot of them never want to talk
no,
about
no,
it.
no, that's true.
But I found that at least 2 or 3 of these individuals, they were sharing their stories with me for like the first time in a
Yeah,
very
yeah,
long time, because they realized now, as they were coming into the twilight of their lives, that it was something they didn't want to do it, but they knew they should.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And I have tremendous respect for that, because it's a little bit like revisiting hell.
It is. It is. I mean, for some people, I mean, many of the people I've interviewed now have felt this burning desire, and their children, it has to be said, because the impact is not just on the victim themselves, but on generational, because it affects the relationships they have with their own children. Some of them became overly protective of their own children. Others didn't have any relationship. They could not, because their own childhood was taken from them, so they couldn't understand what it was to be a child.
I've learned that being a second generation, even a third generation Holocaust survivor, is an intense experience. It's
Absolutely.
different. It's different than, being, not that. And they also talk about, it actually gets passed on through the genes. Trauma can be passed on through the genes. Have you heard that?
Oh no, it's absolutely. I interviewed a man, Michael Metlitz, who was a survivor of Auschwitz and Auschwitz-Birkenau. Now, Michael would be suffering early stages dementia, and or not early stages, but the start of dementia, and all he wanted to do was play his mandolin. And meanwhile, his daughter Susie was crying almost for most of the interview because she wanted him to talk about his experiences, and he was quite happy to listen to her talking about his experiences. And every now and again he'd say to me, but I don't really want to talk about it. And she'd say, but Pa, you've got, why are we talking about it? And he'd say, for so that everyone will learn. And then he'd quietly listen to her, and then he'd say, I'd like to play my mandolin. On the other hand, others really wanted to talk about it. Most really wanted to talk about it. On the odd occasion, you meet people who just have never really spoken about it, or it's just, you can see it's bringing back terrible memories to them. Because those memories never leave you, but it's when you're articulating them, it makes them much more vivid again.
It's amazing. I mean, one of the thoughts I've had, sort of an insight, like a recent insight, is, I think about, I'm 43, and I think about experiences that I had when I was in high school with people who I don't talk to anymore. And that was, 25 years ago. And it was a long time ago. It doesn't feel like it was that long ago, but it was more than half my life ago. And you think about a Holocaust survivor who is maybe 90 years old, and they lost their siblings and their parents when they were only, say, 10 or 20. That is a long time ago. But, in a way, the memory is, you're thinking about your own.
I interviewed a man he's 99. And the memories were as vivid today as they were. He's the only person I would imagine ever to have survived 12 camps, including the Death March, the Warsaw Ghetto, Auschwitz-Birkenau 1 and 2, Auschwitz 1 and 2, and Dachau. And he was fabulous and really wanted to talk about it. But it was as vivid today as it was the day and the years it was happening to him. And it's amazing. Never leaves. My friend Toba, whose dad is a survivor, he had Alzheimer's for the last 10 years, 15 years. I could never go into a shower, even with Alzheimer's, because it just brought back memories to him. And he became hysterical. Memories like that, but they must be told.
They must
be told.
Well, they should be told. Yeah.
We can only learn. We're destined. I know it's a cliche, but we're destined to repeat that which we don't know.
Yeah. And some people come on who aren't educated on it, who aren't reading. It can be frightening because for us, we're educated on it, but you can see that there's people who aren't, and that it's much more likely for that if they're in charge, for something like that to happen.
So I'm interested actually in what your book there. What's it called?
It's called Testimonies from the Heart, a Care One Holocaust anthology. Residents share the journeys of survival with Life Story.
It's fascinating because that's what I'm hoping to do with my own interviews, is to document them in. But it's something that people need. Are they all survivors of the Holocaust?
All survivors. Yeah, one of them is not Jewish, but she talks about her experience helping Jews, hiding Jews in her attic.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. So this is pretty much how my books look. Like I filter pictures in throughout. So I mean, one of these stories of Irving and Miriam is an incredible story. Let me see.
Do you know, I interviewed a woman who was a Lebensborn. I don't know if you heard of the Lebensborn program.
No.
It's called it was called Lebensborn, Lebensborn, and it's the German for Spring of Life. And they set up these hospitals, if you like, and they set up orphanages and that. And they, if you were say fortunate enough to look Aryan, even if you were Jewish or Gypsy, but you measured up to the Aryan ideals of perfection. You were kidnapped by the Nazis, taken and reared as Aryan, or reared as German, non-Jew or non-Gypsy,
Right.
and you were brought up in this Spring of Life program, and they also encouraged Nazi officers to have sex with Aryan-looking women, and
Who?
vice versa, Aryan-looking men, so that they could produce this Aryan race. And it was called the Lebensborn program. Now, there were a lot of Norwegians. Norway was very, after the war, Norway had to pay recompense to a lot of Norwegian women who found out that they were part of the Lebensborn program. And one of them was famously, I think it's Agneta, the dark-haired singer in ABBA. She realized she was one of the Lebensborn program, and they had it very tough as children, because people in the village and everything knew that one member of their family was a Nazi. And the woman I interviewed lives here in Dublin, in Ireland, but she found out that her mother had her for a Nazi, as she called him, a foot soldier. But life she was in 2 orphanages after that, abandoned because of what she was rather than who she was. It's quite sad. Do you know? It's very sad. There were victims in every area of that.
Ugh, unbelievable. I had one client who was a hidden child.
Mm.
And we're talking earliest memories, where her mother had to place her with a Christian family who raised her Christian and pretended she was their daughter, and that she slept in a bed with a cross above her bed, and they baptized her, and
Yeah.
they actually tried to make her a Christian. Like, they weren't really truthful about the situation. They tried, even though she knew something didn't make sense.
Yeah.
And as an adult and throughout her entire life, a lot of her memories, her earliest memories, she didn't know if they were real or if they were dreams.
Mm.
And she had this recurring dream where she would be in a lake underwater, and the dream is her hand would be reaching out of the water surface. And it never made any sense to her. But then somehow she did some research, and she was able to connect with this family that saved her life, but also kind of traumatized her. And when she went and visited them with her husband, she saw that they were coffin makers. They made coffins. And she remembered them, I guess, teasing her. They put her in a coffin, and they were pushing the top down on her, and she was trying to reach out of the coffin. And the whole thing made sense to her. And she was a little bit of a, yeah.
I have Dr. Helena Ganner, who wrote 4 letters to the witness of my childhood. She was similar. She was in hiding from the age of 11, and she was taken in by a Polish prostitute, a Jewish doctor, a reverend mother in a convent, and the last person to protect her was a Nazi officer who saw her hiding behind a curtain, and turned to the other officers as they were walking into the room and said, "Keine Juden here. There are no Jews here." And they all walked out, and he had actually saved her life, and she by not revealing her position behind the curtain. And she talks about how the nun gave her first Holy Communion, but said you can be baptized if you want to. And she said, "No, it's okay." And she wasn't forced. But she said she was never a religious person. She's an atheist now. She was always atheist, Jewish by birth or by ethnicity, but an atheist in her beliefs. But something she said always said to her, "No, I don't need to be baptized. Thank you." And the nun didn't baptize her, but still protected her.
Yeah. And she remembered that
Fascinating listening to people's stories.
Every story is unique, right? Like, no 2 stories of survival are the same.
No, and you could go through, you could have 10 people interviewed about their experiences of Auschwitz-Birkenau at exactly the same period at the time. And every single one of them are different in how they approached it, but all of them had one thing in common, I found, and that was faith, and not necessarily in a God or in a being, but the belief that if only I can last for another hour or another day or another week, I'll get through this. And that's the one thing they said that held them through was faith.
Yeah. I've in my experience, I don't exactly think of it that way. I mean, I think some of them were just convinced they were going to die, but they would they would live the next minute, live, as long as they could, live the next hour.
No, but
One of them that I'm thinking about,
that in itself is a messianic faith. It's a
I
a
suppose,
belief that I have to keep going for whatever reason.
that you have to keep
You
going.
know,
Yeah.
just get through the next hour. I may die in 2 hours, but just get through the next hour.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know.
Talk. So I did a really interesting book on about a man who he grew up in Berlin. He wasn't Jewish. When he was 5 years old, the British bombs were falling on Berlin, and he and his mother and sister had to evacuate. Meanwhile, his grandfather was drafted against his will into the Nazis, where he died. And his father, they were trying to draft into the Nazis, and they would have, except that his father was traveling for work. His father was in communications, so he was setting up communications towers. Actually, it turns out, for the Germans. But he ended up getting picked up by the Russians and stuck in a holding prison for 4 years. And he managed to make it home barely. And my client Joachim and his sister and mother, they went out to Poland, and for I don't know how long, I don't remember how long it was, maybe, at least a year, maybe, or a year and a half or 2 years, their whole job was to avoid the Russian soldiers. And his mother ended up getting raped by a Russian soldier. Oh. And that was an amazing insight, because a lot of the Nazis, they weren't there because they wanted to be. And even the non-Jews, I mean, it's a little bit, they had to worry about the Russian soldiers.
Yeah.
And it's just, a whole nother sort of, I don't know if you call it a Holocaust story, but it's another kind of survival World War II story.
Yeah, of course it is. I mean, as I say, I interviewed John Wood, whose father was Lieutenant Colonel. I'll think of his name in a minute now, but he was the first British officer to enter Bergen-Belsen to liberate the camp, and he took over Leonard Burney and Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Burney, and he liberated the camp and took over the humanitarian side of it. And I also interviewed Zoltan Zinkalis, whose adopted father, the man who adopted him, was Dr. Bob Collis, who founded the Cerebral Palsy Clinic here in Ireland, and was the first person he proofread Christy Brown's book, My Left Foot.
Yeah.
It was made into.
Love that movie. Great movie.
Yeah. And it was actually he who convinced Christy Brown to write My Left Foot. So it's fascinating. And he was one of the medical liberators of Bergen-Belsen. But it's fascinating to listen to people's stories, and no matter whether it's a genocide story or something less traumatic, everybody has this wonderful journey of where they came from to where they are right now in their lives.
I wanted to, you mentioned the, liberation. I wanted to tell you this one story from this book of Irving and Miriam. So Miriam's, she grew up in Poland, and she talks about her childhood. They were poor, they actually had a decent amount of land, but it wasn't very fertile. And, she ended up being in a concentration camp, and she survived, and eventually they were liberated. And when she was in the displaced persons camp, she met this American soldier, Irving, who came from Brooklyn. He was Orthodox. He spoke Yiddish. And so when he arrived, he could speak with her because he spoke Yiddish. Yeah. And he saw her, and he said to his fellow soldiers, he said, "No one touch that woman. I'm going to marry her." And it was the prophecy of his life, because for his bar mitzvah parsha, it was ki tetzeh. And it says in the Torah, it says, "When you will go out to war, you will meet a beautiful woman with a shaven head, and you will bring her back." And that was the prophecy of his life.
Wow.
And it's just incredible, right? And so they got married there, and then he brought her back to Brooklyn, where they lived for decades upon decades. They both passed fairly recently, but I talked with their children a lot. I interviewed them, and I know their children, and it was just amazing.
What was it? Just an interest in storytelling in general, or was it a particular interest in one particular area of stories that you were interested in? Was it when you look back in it, was it your grandfather's stories telling the fact that he used to tell you his stories all the time that actually brought this out in you, I suppose, the desire to tell other people's stories? Is it in your nature to be inquisitive?
Oh yeah, very much so. I mean,
yeah.
I love talking to people, and one of my sort of hallmarks I think that I have going for me is that people like to talk to me. I'm very easygoing. I set a very warm atmosphere, and I, especially with my clients, and it's very important to do that. I set people at ease, and we just get going, and we always bond. My clients become my friends. They open themselves up to me, and I'm very respectful of that privilege, that honor. And through the talking, and I'm just very present and engaged, and I can make certain connections. And through the questions that I ask, people always think of things they haven't thought about in years. But when my grandfather, when I was getting my second master's degree in fiction writing, is when my grandfather asked me if I would write his life story. And my first thought was, well, Grandpa, I'm pretty busy. I'm getting a master's and I have a full-time job. And then I was like, all right, I'm going to interview you and I'm going to record it. And that way we're going to have fantastic interviews, and I'll have them recorded. And then from there, I can sort of at my leisure, I can transcribe them and I can edit your words. And I ended up doing it really quickly, actually. And that's when I had the idea as a business. And I realized that my love, because I was always thinking, how am I going to make a living as a writer? It's not an easy thing to do. And it became the perfect marriage between my passion and my, my passion for writing and my love of story, and a way to make a business.
And your need for money.
Yeah, and that. You gotta support the family.
There is a saying that you'll if you do what you love, you'll never work a day in your life.
I've heard that, yeah.
And you're doing exactly what you love. Richard, when you're setting out to actually interview people or to write the book, what is your if you don't mind me asking, what is your process? Do you go and you interview people, and then how do you take it from there?
Right. So I interview people, ideally in person. With COVID, it's been over Zoom, but I've had a lot of success with it. I'm still able to, set everyone at ease, and as long as we don't have technology problems.
Terrible.
Right. But so I do the interviews. Interviews are typically in 2-hour increments. So if someone's gonna, do a 6-hour interview or an 8-hour interview, and obviously the longer I interview someone for, the more information we can get, and the book becomes bigger, and we can get more in depth. And that's kind of how I come up with what it will cost. Is how long I will interview someone for. But I do it in 2-hour increments. So, over a number of sessions, I record it, I transcribe it, and then I edit their words. So my goal really is to strike the perfect balance between maintaining their essence, capturing their voice, so that when their family reads it, they're like, oh, that's dad, or, that's grandma. Oh yeah. I can totally hear their voice coming through. And editing it enough where it's actually an engaging read, so that someone who never met them before would still, find it a professional reading quality.
There's a thin line then, of course, that you have to draw with people, say, who are maybe speaking with a broken English accent, may not be grammatically correct, and you're trying to transpose what they've said in such a way that still their voice can be heard, but yet the reader can actually understand. Because I know that there's lots of people that I've interviewed down through the years, and they might get phrases backwards, or they might have the syntax mightn't be grammatically correct or in the
or
correct order,
idiomatically correct.
but
Right.
I understand them. But it's putting it down into writing then that other people can understand. Do you know that? I mean, you can't write SIC after in square brackets when you're writing fiction, but you know, so you're trying to make it readable, but still for the families to understand. That's different. Produces, I suppose, difficulties as well.
This is a kind of a philosophical issue that I've been thinking about a lot lately, because the way that I have handled the editing has changed. It's developed, you know, as I've gotten into it, it's grown.
Yeah.
As I've become better at what I do, and just learned more and seen people's reactions to, you know, what they receive.
Yeah.
Because in the beginning, you know, earlier on, one of the first books I did was a Holocaust survivor, Paul. He was from Lodz, Poland, and it was just wonderful. This is actually him here. This is one of the earlier books I did, and
they're the most amazing photographs.
that's fantastic. This is right after liberation. So he you know, he really lost his childhood. I mean, I think he was, you know, in 1939, I think he was maybe 11 years old.
Yeah.
And by the time it was finished, he was 17 years old. But he, you know, he spoke English as a second language. And when you read his book, it's apparent that he speaks English as a second language. I did a lot of, you know, I still did a lot of editing. It's major reorganization. It's removing redundancy, and you know, giving it a structure, breaking it into sections, chapters, all of that. But I left a lot of his idioms so that you can tell he speaks English as a second language. Now my thought is that I want to actually, I want to kind of help elevate my clients a little bit, so that they're really, really proud of it. And by taking out those idioms and editing them so that it's more of a seamless read, and that the reader doesn't become kind of pulled out or like conscious of the fact that, oh, that's kind of idiomatically not right, that it's more real smooth and seamless. But I don't think it changes their voice, because it doesn't change their story, you know, and it doesn't change their essence. And in some cases, a client will say something, you know, sometimes there's a wider gap between what you say and what you mean. In some cases, I'll actually rewrite an entire sentence or group of sentences because I know what they mean.
You're paraphrasing it.
Yeah, right. And where possible, I'm keeping their words. But sometimes I'm not. And that's rare, but like I do find there are those cases where it's just going to be better for me to rephrase it.
I think I don't know if you ever read the book Mouse by Art Spiegelman.
Yeah, I have it right up here actually.
I have it. I'm buying a new book shelf, so I have all my books away in actually, if you were to look at my bookshelf, you'd think I did nothing else but read Holocaust books.
Oh yeah,
because it's just you know, Art Spiegelman had this fantastic way of, for people who haven't read Mouse, and why it was called Mouse, and why he represented his dad and his mother and Anya and his stepmother as mice, was because the Nazis would have seen them as vermin. So he used them, and then the Poles he represented as pigs, and he represented the French as frogs. So he stereotyped everybody, so that in the same way as the Nazis would have stereotyped at the time. And what I found interesting was everything was in Vladik's voice. It was all the broken English. You were there and you were looking at the syntax of all the sentences, and they were completely wrong. And he still managed to show that just how much Vladik could just as much be, if you like, a racist or just as ignorant, if you like, of people. When the taxi driver turned up and the taxi driver was black, and he was holding on to his groceries in case the groceries would be stolen, because hold on to your groceries, you know, and making assumptions about other people based
just on human stuff,
not on ethnicity now like he had been, but on the color of their skin. And it was a wonderful way of actually telling the story through through a stereotype, if you like, that would have been heaped on his father, and the fraught relationship between Vladek and Art. They never had a good relationship. On the other hand, many survivors had fantastic relationships with their children. But he just managed to get that dialogue going, if you like, that showed that kept true to Vladek's accent.
Yeah, yeah, interesting.
Without it being confusing to a reader. You knew it was Vladek. You knew he was, well, as the daughter of an immigrant to this country, my dad was English, and he had his own way of saying things, and all my friends used to look at him and they just hadn't a clue what he was saying. I knew what he was saying. Nobody else did.
Was it Northern England? Did he sound like
No,
Scottish?
he had a Welsh, okay, a Welsh English accent. He sounded like Anthony Hopkins. Everyone used to say, "Oh, your dad sounds so much like Anthony Hopkins," but no one understood a word he said, including my mother. She'd regularly say to me, "Mary, what's your father saying?" And I'd have to translate. Both of them were speaking English.
Right. And he was probably, one day he was like, "Will you marry me?" And she was like, I don't know what you're saying. Yeah.
She understood that all right. Yeah. She was Irish, he was English, and she was just like, "What's your father saying?"
Right.
So yeah. I suppose that's why I was asking you the question about writing without losing the person's identity in a way that the other part, the reader, can understand.
Yeah, and I think even if I, like in Paul's book, I left his idioms, the way he spoke, his syntax, the way he spoke English. I left that, and it's totally easy to follow. But and I guess my thoughts on like this kind of philosophical question will not remain static. I suppose they'll continue to develop. But I've come to the, like with my grandfather's book, some people they say good when they should say well, right? Yeah. When they're modifying, the verb. And so I started with my clients, if they say good when it should be well, I edit it and I change it to well. That's kind of where I am now, yeah, with it, because I think that they'll be, I'm sort of advocating for them and like protecting them, and like it's their legacy. They're not going to be here forever, but it's gonna be around. And and anyway, I'm the editor, and so a lot of the editing I do, it's really just, or almost a lot of it is kind of superficial level. It's like and removing. You
self-publish?
Yeah, I self-publish. I have a printer that I use, and I have my own logo. Yeah, but I also help some clients if they want to put it on Amazon and sell it, and try to sell it commercially. I can help that with that. But I also actually I do some ghostwriting, and I'm doing some nonfiction book proposals, which are intended for commercial audiences. But that's different than sort of what I'm doing with Life Story.
It's funny, back to Art Spiegelman again. It's funny how his book for a long time was put in the fiction section of bookstores because it was representing Poles and Jews and French as pigs, frogs, and vermin. It was considered, oh, this is fictional, until he argued profusely after winning the Pulitzer Prize for it, that he argued that it was absolutely and utterly factual. And it was actually, so it's one of those books that kind of becomes fact, fiction, diary, memoir, autobiography, biography,
and graphic novel.
A photographic novel, or graphic novel. It's everything. It's kind of like a mixture of all genres. It's an amazing book,
It's amazing.
Do you know? And I have read some fantastic books. That my favorite graphic novel, I suppose, on it would be Auschwitz by Pascal Crochet. Just love that book. I just love the artwork. As an artist, I love the artwork in it. It's just there's one page in it with 2 pages that are just smoke and words, and they represent the whispers of the camps, the whispering that was going on about what was happening in the gas chambers. So when they enter the gas chambers and you turn the page, all you see is smoke on the 2 pages and words like help and things like that. And it speaks loudest about the silence or the whispers, and but for the words you wouldn't know what was going on inside there, and but for the whisperings that was going on outside you wouldn't know what was going on. You have to read it, or you have to buy it.
Yeah.
He's a French artist who wrote the book, but everything, all the caricatures, everything is perfectly mapped. All the maps inside it are all hand drawn. Everything is just it's just an explosion of art. It's wonderful, and literature. I just love it as a book. But what are you going to do? What's your next venture, Richard?
As in stories that I'm working on with
Yeah.
my clients.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot going on. I'm working on probably 10 books right now, but I just finished the draft and I sent it to my client for his review. The guy is fantastic. His name's Steven. He lives in New York City. He grew up in Prague. He was born in 1932, Jewish. And in 1939, the Nazis came in. I mean, there's so much to it. His father had been in World War I in the cavalry. So he was sort of like on reserve. So he was drafted back in. And the Czech army, my client, he was 7 years old. He can remember being in his grandparents' jewelry store over Wenceslas Plaza, which is like the main square, and watching the Czech army march out, going to the front to meet the Nazis who were coming. And then, but the Czech army decided they weren't going to fight. They were going to be, massacred. So they stood down. But the Czech army told the Jewish officers, they said, you have 48 hours until the Nazis get here. You can leave. So his father went straight to London. Meanwhile, my client can remember being in the same place in his grandfather's jewelry store and watching the Nazis march in, exactly the opposite way that the Czech army marched out. It took the Czech army 2 hours to march out. It took the Nazi army all day to march in. They were massive. And then he and his brother and mother, basically his mother had to smuggle them out by train. His mother was Christian, and she had a passport or a visa to leave. And when they were on the train and the Gestapo was coming through, she bribed one of the train personnel to take her 2 sons to the kitchen car.
Yeah.
And they went there and they hung out for a couple hours peeling potatoes. Meanwhile, the car was uncoupled and moved over to be loaded with food. And the mother saw that. And meanwhile, she's trying to play it cool with the Gestapo, showing her visa and everything. Okay. They were recoupled and they made it to Holland. And then they took the boat over to London. And then there was issue with customs. And then they lived in London for 2 years during the Blitz. And they had to go underground almost every night as German bombs fell.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And then they jumped on a ship that took them through U-boat filled waters down to Argentina and then to New York. And by the time he got off the boat in Argentina, he didn't remember feeling frightened, but there was this general dread that they could be bombed by U-boat bombers, and that if they went into the freezing cold water, they'd have 4 minutes before their limbs failed them. Anyway, when he got off the boat, he had a terrible stutter that plagued him for decades, an awful stutter.
It's funny. It wasn't Argentina, the country I was thinking there, where Mengele was hidden.
Yeah.
After World War II. It's just striking that he would find himself in the same country. Do you know that Mengele was hidden in? You'd be trying to escape, and then you'd find yourself in the same country as one of the worst people known in history. Do you know? But
small world.
We have it in our own country. I mean, sadly, Ireland, and I've written about it. We were one of the countries who were part of the Evian conference to refuse to take in any refugees. But yet we hid known Nazis. Celestine Artikovich, we had Otto Scorseni, who was Scarface. He was the person who helped Mussolini escape. Albert Folans, they lived very fruitful lives, many of them here in Ireland, and yet we sent 300 Jewish children away from the shores. We all have a lot. That's why it's back to what we were saying there earlier about everyone's history becomes our history once we learn about it. You can never unlearn what you've learned. I can never not know what I know about people suffering then, and then it becomes mine, because what do I do with it now that I know, now that I've learned about the Inga Auerbackers or the Tommy Reichenthal's of the world, or what do I do with their stories now that I have them? Do I keep them forever? In which case, it's like I need to pass this on so that somebody else can make that choice. At that point, do they hold on to the memories or do they pass them on? It becomes that baton that you continuously hope will be passed on through generations. Otherwise, we're just going to keep repeating everything that is bad and everything that was bad. And I can see it happening all the time now today still. Because, there's no... How important do you think it is that storytelling is taught in schools and that children are awakened to the idea of listening to stories? I regret not having recorded my mother's stories. I regret not keeping a diary. You have young children now of your own. Have you ever thought of keeping a diary every day, a diary of every little move they make, whether it's photographic or literary, so that you can actually write about those steps as they happen? And how important do you think it is that school children at a young age are encouraged to sit and listen to somebody else's story and rewrite it in their own form? About, if I'm listening to Richard Squires' story and I start to write, what did Richard Squires say to me? And even if it's paraphrased, what Richard Squires said, you're encouraging that creativity in children. You're also encouraging them to remember someone else's past.
I think it's brilliant. I never thought about that. It's what a brilliant idea. I mean, storytelling is beyond important, right? Because it's a way of documenting, history and reflections and thoughts and just humanity. And the more it's done, the more we can sort of agree on what history is, right? And I think of like William Faulkner's famous quote. He says, "History isn't even in the past; it's in the present."
Well, it is. That's what I'm saying. It's very much present. From the minute you learn about history, from the minute you read about history, it becomes present.
Right. It's not just back there in the past.
No.
History's not ancient. It's not history.
No,
it's not. With us. It's with us currently. And the better that we are able to handle that, the more tools we have to handle it, then the better we can handle it, and the better use we can make of it, and to teach that skill to children. And we do a little bit. There's a little creative writing, but what you're talking about, I mean, that's brilliant. I think it's brilliant.
we should sit down and tease it out further.
That's a whole curriculum. Yeah.
I just think it would be a wonderful. That's what it's something I've always wanted to do. Is the idea of just getting children to just sit down, pick a child, or for a child to be chosen for them, because sometimes they'll always end up choosing their friends. It's easy to pick your friends. Sometimes not. It's so easy to pick the child that's just after coming into the class, who may be the foreign national, the immigrant, or the not so cool child, the outsider, and sit down and find out their story. And if it only means them taking a tape recorder and then recording that child's story with permission from parents and things like that, and then putting it in their own words, writing a little story about what I found out about John today.
I mean, that will teach compassion and empathy
Compassion,
and seeing
empathy.
it from people's, seeing other people's points of view. I mean, it's brilliant. We need more of that. And I do feel that.
And it's done in a fun way, and it's done,
Yeah.
It's not like you're forcing someone to be compassionate, which I don't believe you can. You can't teach someone to be empathetic, but you can mold their environment that helps them to actually develop this empathy. I personally think empathy is something that you're born with, but you can be educated into. I think some people are overly empathetic. I'm probably very empathetic about people, but sometimes you can give them the tools that develop that empathy.
I mean, that was my experience in undergrad. Like, I was always very empathetic, compassionate, always.
That's
But
what we do, Richard.
yeah, but still, there was so much more to learn. And we all have. I think that we all have our. If you go far enough, you hit your kind of wall of ignorance, and we're always trying to expand it more and more, and that's part of growing up, right? But just to try to imagine the experiences of some people whose lives are just so different than yours that you possibly and actually, coming to the realization that there's no way that you really can understand what it's like to be in their shoes, but at least by understanding that, recognizing that, then you can be in a place where you're open to learning something. In mindfulness, it's just so vital, and we're surrounded by, I find that I'm more mindful and empathetic than even people around me who are still pretty empathetic. But I see their limits, and I try to help, try to teach. But it can be frustrating to do that.
But I mean, they talk about all of us being in this world more alike than we are different, and I suppose my background, my father had an Irish father, but a Welsh mother, and her grandmother was Jewish, and they were Protestant and they were Catholic, and I'm the only Catholic. So I suppose I always grew up not understanding that anyone was different. Even going to school, it was always convent schools. I had all nuns in school, but I was the only one that in this whole school that had a Protestant grandmother, Protestant cousins, and a Jewish background. So there was always that understanding that there was a difference, but yet a similarity in all of us. But I suppose I've always felt that the fact that we're all different is what makes us similar. I'm foreign to you, you're foreign to me, and it's actually foreignness and difference that makes us same. And it's, Jacques Derrida, the French Albanian Jewish philosopher, said that to understand the other person, you must first understand the other within yourself. Because the other I'm projecting to you might be a completely different other that you're projecting to your friends or to your colleagues or and everyone sees you differently. So therefore we're all really multiple. We've multiple others within us. So
Yes,
when we say, oh, that person is other, they're different. Well, we're all different. We're even different to ourselves, that we project so many different images to different people, depending on whether we feel comfortable with them, whether we like them, whether they like us, whether we know they like us, instinctively, or whether we instinctively feel that they don't like us. Those others are projected. So I think we should be conscious of the fact that every person is just an other of ourselves that we've got to try and get to know at some point. And I think a good way to do it is through starting with children, getting them to tell a 10-minute story about themselves in their own words, write it down, and don't put it word for word, but paraphrase it. What did John say about his life? So you're actually hearing it from the horse's mouth. You're not making an assumption about that person. You're actually finding out exactly from him how he feels in a new school, in a new country, with a new language. Or how does he feel being around boys that don't like him or are bullying him? What are his feelings about it? It helps him, it helps them, and it develops empathy.
So much, I mean, everything you're saying resonates with me. And there's a lot in there. There's
a whole curriculum.
I mean, yeah. I mean, when you said the horse's mouth, early in Life Story, I was trying to come up with a name for my business. And I thought, oh, the horse's mouth, because, because I love that, like, these books, they're told in first person. It's my clients telling their own story with their own words. Right. But it's so interesting, how attitude,
I might call my own the horse's mouth.
Okay. Yeah. It sounds good. But yeah, I mean, things can be framed a million ways. I mean, first of all, we all speak different languages and we all have different characters depending on the context and who we're talking to, whether we're at work or with our friends or speaking to an authority figure, right? It's like we are adaptable. We adapt to the situation and to what we want. And just the idea of the story of, like, the new kid coming into school from, he doesn't speak the language, he has no friends. And a lot of, like, the messaging and attitude comes from the top, right? Say it comes from how the teacher sets the tone, or how the principal sets the tone, or even even higher than that, how the politicians set the tone. But
the parents
and the parents, right? So you got this kid coming in, he doesn't speak the language. Someone can call him a loser, but another person can say, this is fantastic. Here's this guy coming in with completely different experience, and it's an opportunity for us to learn about the world. This is great. It can be spun so many different ways, right? But one other thing that I thought about before is the idea of difference, right? Like we don't want to just accept diversity. We want to celebrate diversity, because diversity is beautiful. It's wonderful. And actually, like out in nature, when you have a habitat that is biologically diverse, that's a healthy habitat. When you have a habitat that is all the same and it gets one disease, it kills the whole thing. So when I think about how the Nazis they wanted one master race, the Aryan race. If they got their way and there was one race on this planet, one disease would wipe them all out. And then that'd be the end of humanity. So if the Nazis got their way, I mean, they weren't thinking scientifically. They weren't listening to reason and science.
I'm just thinking, there was a movie, and I'm just trying to think of the name of it. I actually lectured on it a while back, and the child, he was always in trouble. It was done in the 60s in England, on a shoestring, and it was incredible acting. All the children in the school were actually the actors in the film, and he had a hawk, and he used to train the hawk to come to him, and he'd starve the hawk for a day or whatever, and then gradually he'd feed the hawk, and the hawk would come and land on his hand. And he was an outsider. He had his friends, but they were always in trouble, until the teacher started to ask him to talk about, what is this hawk that you have? And he came up to the top of the class, and a child who couldn't do maths, he couldn't do anything else, but he could talk for 20 minutes and hold the entire class spellbound, listening to him talk about the hawk, and how, and the terminology of the gloves that he used, and how he'd get the hawk to come back, and then the teacher would ask him questions, and suddenly he became the teacher in the class. And suddenly from that, the children's eyes started to see him in a completely different light. No longer was he the troublemaker or in trouble all the time. No longer was he a failure in the class. He was now the teacher. He was now telling them something that they didn't know and that they hadn't known. And it was the teacher was suddenly after finding the spark that made him light up inside in the class. And
That's
trying to think of the
beautiful.
name of it.
It's beautiful. It makes me think in education for me, I've been an educator. Currently I'm a tutor. I
Yeah.
was a college teacher. I also taught some high school, but my wife, she's a teacher. She's a math teacher. And, one of the things that they talk about is that the troublemaker, it's not that he wants to be the troublemaker, or like the kid who is failing. He doesn't actually want to be failing. Whereas a lot of teachers kind of interpret it that way, where they say, it's you're doing it to yourself, but what you need to do is you need to figure out what the person's strengths are.
Yeah.
And it takes that kind of care.
And the potential is that the child everything could be moving too slow for the child, because they could be an overachiever in an underachieving class for them. Because or they could be the artistic child like I was, and the teachers used to say, oh, she's very bright, but she should stop looking out the window counting the leaves on the trees, because I wasn't remotely interested in maths.
And you may have had a teacher that took that personally against her and thought that you were purposely being wise, rude.
Yeah, no, well, we had all nuns, and and I had one teacher for English, and she was singularly the teacher that impressed me the most in all my years in school, Mary Jackman. And she was the reason I went on and did a PhD in English and 2 masters in English. And and I do think a teacher can have an effect on your life, good or bad. And for me, when you look back in your life and you ask what teachers stood out to you, it was 2 teachers, and both were English. And art, I loved art and history, and they were the teachers that stood out. I do remember one of our nuns going outside the door and crying because she couldn't teach the class because nobody was listening to her. And I feel sorry now when I think back. Poor nun, she was outside the door bawling her eyes out because she couldn't teach us
It's hard to get that control back once you lose it.
Huh?
It's hard once you lose the classroom. It's hard to get it back.
She had lost that, and she was a gentle little nun.
Yeah.
But she it wasn't anything I did. I was actually very quiet in school, but she just couldn't. She just lost control of the class, and she was outside crying. But Kes is the name of the movie. Kes, Kes. You have to watch it. It's difficult.
Write that down.
It'll be difficult for you to understand the accent. Because it's North of England accent,
Yeah.
but the acting in it is superb, and the story behind it, the discipline that was in the schools, the punishment that they used to receive, the slapping of their hands for every mistake, and this one teacher who was really cross suddenly found a way in to this child, and was able to instill empathy in the class and appreciation for him in a class where he wasn't appreciated up to then. They all thought, oh, it's only he's no good. But suddenly he became when the student becomes the teacher. And that's what we all hope to, as I suppose educators, to have that eureka moment when the student suddenly wakes up. And I had one lad in my class in 3rd level, and he was just sitting there with his hand. I could see him day one, and the coat over his head. And suddenly I mentioned we were talking about sport, and I mentioned my cousin was a professional golfer, and the hood came down, and he started to pay attention. And I had him for the rest of the term because he was into golf. And I had found out he was into golf, and I brought up golf, and he asked me, could I introduce him to my cousin? And it was just like, that was, my way in
Yeah.
with him. And I won't say he was very intelligent, but just was bored stiff in college. And he was doing mathematics and physical education, but he had to do philosophy as part of it. So he had no interest in philosophy. But
those connections, it requires, that's a personal touch. It requires that kind of care. A lot of teachers, maybe don't give that kind of care. I personally don't think teachers are valued the way that they should be. Teachers are vital. You want to have a country that is super competitive and full of smart people. Well, you probably have good teachers, and value them and make being a teacher an occupation that's actually desirable.
Well, we should sit down and talk more about these ideas.
Yeah.
But meanwhile, Richard, thank you so very much for being a guest on my show. And what's the name of your book again, for anyone that wants to buy it?
So the Holocaust anthology. Well, the company is Life Story. The Holocaust anthology is called Testimonies from the Heart. It's on the printer I use is called Blurb. So if you were to go on blurb.com and put in Testimonies from the Heart, you would find it. But it might be easier just to contact me, and I can be reached. My website is www.lifestorymemoir.com. My email is richard@lifestorymemoir.com. You can call me as well. In the United States, you should probably just email me, I guess. Most of your listeners are over in the UK there.
Ireland.
Ireland, right. The UK is not all four of those countries. No, not.
No.
Excuse me.
You're stepping into dangerous territory.
Okay. The UK is England. I got it.
UK is England.
Yeah, you guys are in Ireland.
The north of Ireland
Very different.
Is part of the. It's still occupied.
I understand. Okay, all right.
But
I'm not up on the politics. Excuse me.
Yeah. No, the south. I'm in the south.
Okay.
I'm in the south of Ireland. We're in the Republic of Ireland.
Okay. I definitely want to. I want to get over there sometime.
I'm English by birth.
Got it.
So I'm English. But Richard, it was an absolute joy chatting to you, and I hope.
Thank you.
I hope to talk further.
That'd be great. Yeah. And so, if any of your listeners are, maybe interested in learning more about Life Story, creating a memoir for themselves or a loved one, please do reach out.
Well, Shindera leis an clár, that's the end of the show for today. Until the next time, le cúnamh dé. Bwalam tú go léir te cána sonas agus grá agus go dé sibh slán. Bye, Richard.
Take care.
You too. Bye-bye.